Once again, I've had a month where I've listened more to my audiobooks than actually reading my physical copies, and I do not like it. I just missed those moments where I could sit down with a book and read for hours. Instead, I'm sitting here reading 10 minutes at a time, whereas I could listen to an audiobook for hours on end without any problem. The biggest reason why I've spent so much time listening to audiobooks this season is this guy, Karl Ove Knausgaard, and in October I listened to these 3 books. They are truly the perfect books to listen to, and the reason is that they are very easy to follow. It's all about Karl Ove Knausgaard's life. Karl Ove Knausgaard is famous for talking a lot about little. So if you zone out a bit, it doesn't really matter, because he might still be talking about his wet dreams when you get your focus back. I'll just talk briefly about each of these and then I'll try to summarize at the end. So I read the first one last month and then I started reading number 2. So the first one I wasn't really sure about. There was something there that dragged me to the story and kept me there while I was all the way through thinking, why am I doing this? In the second novel, I understood why I was reading Knausgård, and that's because number 2 was too real. At least very relatable. He has moved to Sweden, he has gotten himself a family, and he talks about how much he wants to be left alone, and how hard it is to be around other parents, and how kids can be a challenging thing in one's life. In some ways this could have been a sitcom, because he describes small situations that becomes big, and sitcoms would have made those funny, but he just talks about why he hates his life. He also is very specific in how he hates others and why. For example, feminine men, obese people, and men that shave their heads. So there is a lot to talk about, or not. At least I enjoyed this read. The third novel I did not enjoy that much. It's all about his upbringing. I must say that the most interesting part of this novel, for me at least, is the relationship towards his father and how he thinks about it. But at the same time, it always ends up with him describing how he cries, and after a while that gets a bit tiresome, and it didn't really affect me as a reader. The fourth one I liked better. It's all about him being a young adult, getting his first real job. He moves way up north in Norway and he becomes a teacher at an elementary school. The thing I liked about this one is how he described north of Norway in the early 80s and the local community, which is really small, and how people related to each other. We also get the first glimpse of Knausgård wanting to become a writer and trying to publish a novel. And that's a really interesting process. He also talks about attending a local writing course in Bergen, where some of the teachers are Ragnar Hovland and Jon Fosse, and he talks about them as local amateurs and feels bad that they couldn't get proper writers, which is today really funny. I'm still going to make a video when I read all of these books, but so far I think he's really good at reaching everyone in some way. When you read Knausgård, you can't really be passive, you have to partake in the books, because he says a lot of honest things and a lot of things that other people wouldn't say out loud, and certainly not publish it in a book. And as a reader, this is very entertaining, because I have to stop and think. No matter how idiotic the things he says are, what would I have done in that situation, or what do I think about the things he's saying? It's quite easy to get upset by the things he says sometimes. So far I've read 4 books and I'm still questioning why I like them or why I keep doing this, and that's because they're, to me, quite uneven. I like the language in all of them, but at some point they're so unengaging. But suddenly I get a quote that I write down and think one day I'll revisit this quote, which doesn't happen really often. So it all boils down to whether I could see myself in the situations he's describing, or if the situations are so bananas that they're just kind of amusing. But still one question remains, and that is, what is he not telling us? That's the thing I keep on thinking about when I'm reading these books, because everyone has something that they don't want to discuss with others, and since Knausgård really talks about most of the things that one could imagine people going through, what is he not able to or willing to tell us? Maybe we'll find out. I have no idea. But I think I will read the last 2 books in this series before New Year's. I'm not sure. The last book is gigantic. Yeah, I really don't know, but 4 down and 2 to go at least. One book I was going to finish before the year ended was this one, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. This was a part of my 5 big books of 2022 challenge for myself, and the last one on the list. I had medium expectations for this book. The thing that made me read it was Neil Gaiman recommended it, and the thing that has not going for it is its size, because the Norwegian version is almost 900 pages. So this is set in the 1800s in England, and it's about 2 magicians. Most of the book is about England fighting Napoleon and France with the help of this one magician. Suddenly this other magician appears. They become rivals. They do not get along, and they're quite the opposite of each other, and they have different world views. Also, there is a lot of politics involved in this, because the government wants the help of magicians to fight Napoleon, and the magicians get things in return. Reading this novel was at times like reading a non-fiction because of the language. All the magical things are explained in such a systematic way, and also how people relate to each other. And there's also a ton of footnotes, making this book maybe a couple of 100 pages more than it could have been. Or should have been. Sometimes the footnotes take up more than the actual text on pages, which could be and was really frustrating at times, especially when the sole purpose of the footnotes is explaining the history of the magic. I think the footnotes could have been a separate book, and it would have made sense. Also, this book doesn't really focus on the magic that much, I would say. It focuses more on the magicians. So there's no real magic system like in high fantasy novels. You get explained how this and that works. It's more casually mentioned sometimes how one specific formula works, but that's about it. My favorite thing about this novel is the humor, because it is quite humorous at times, especially with the Magicians Club, because it seems like a club for pretty nerdy men that wants to come and discuss magic, and they're called theoretical magicians, which I thought was fun. The smaller footnotes could also be fun, especially when they were quite absurd, which they were sometimes. And those reminded me quite a lot of Good Omens by Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett, in the way that they actually gave something to the story, namely humor, but they were a bit too far between. As I said, it didn't really feel like I was reading a fantasy novel at times. It felt more like historical fiction, which is okay, but also it wasn't what I was least expecting, but at the same time it wasn't that engaging. Maybe it would have helped if they cut out Napoleon and other figures from that time. To close this one off, I would say that I could have done without 400 pages in this novel. But still, I thought it was okay. And now over to something completely different, and it's one of the nominees for this year's Nordic Council Literature Prize, and it's Linn Ullmann with Jente 1983. Translated, it's Girl 1983. It's a non-fiction fiction. Some of it has happened and some of it is fictionalized after what I could gather. In 1983, Linn Ullmann is 16 years old. She lives in New York with her mother, and she travels to Paris. Here she's attending a photo shoot with a 30-year-old older man she calls A. Ullmann tries to reconstruct her memories from an incident that happened with this A in 1983, nearly 40 years ago. I would say that there are 2 big themes in this novel, the first being Me Too and the other one being memories. She tries to tell us what really happened in Paris, and it's a bit messy at times and a bit all over the place, and she's talking to this second person that we really don't know who is, but she's trying to tell her what happened in order to remember herself. That had a major effect on me as a reader. I felt like this book was uncomfortable and claustrophobic. It sort of dragged me into what happened without telling me all the things that happened, and it was up to me to reconstruct my own memories of what she might have gone through, and that made this awful read. I like the book, but it's hard to like what she describes. And after a while she also starts talking about how this all affected her physically and mentally, and this was uncomfortable as well, but also very useful. Summarized, I would say that it's a good book about a very difficult topic. It has been hugely popular in the mainstream Norway, so I'm interested to see if it's going to win the prize. They're going to announce the winner of this year's Nordic Council Literature Prize before this video is being published, but for now I don't know. So I am interested to see who wins. Another novel that might win this year's prize is this one, Løpe by Kerstin Ekman. Translated it would be Run Wolf or Running Wolf. And this is about a 70-year-old hunter that has been shooting and killing animals all his life. But one day he sees a wolf. He starts caring for this wolf, and at the same time that this happens, also it happens quite a whole lot in the local community and in the hunting team that he is a part of. It's not a big book by any means, but it tackles the themes of growing old and I would say the climate crisis. Kerstin Ekman has written a lot of crime fiction earlier, and this is no exception. There is some crime fiction in this one as well. But it has a beautiful language, a language that I many times stopped and thought about when I read it. I'm saying that like that's something special, it is for me, and I would actually claim that the language in this novel is more important to me than what it is about, which I think it's the first time I'm saying, but it's just tenderness. You felt compassion with the main character, just a atmospheric piece of literature. This might win the prize as well. At least I really enjoyed reading this one. This has been a huge success in Sweden so far, and will be continued to be so, I guess. Staying both in crime fiction and in Sweden, it's Lars Kepler and The Fire Witness, the third book in the Linn series. These ones fill my need for Nordic noir crime fiction type of thing. And in this novel it gets more personal with our detective, and we get to hear more about his story. Also, he's been suspended, sort of, something like that, and he can't partake in any investigations. So in the crimes that have been committed in this novel, he is just an observer, which is kind of hard for him. I'm not going to go into detail in this novel, but some gruesome crimes have been committed at this youth home. 2 people have been killed and several people may be in the danger zone. As always with these books, there's a lot of history, a lot of looking back at things that have happened before. Linn is a stubborn man that often gets things right and annoys people around him. But also we get to meet a couple of favorite characters from earlier books that reappear in this one, which I really enjoyed. This is by far my favorite one due to the high pacing, and also that I connected with the characters in a much more deeper way than I would have done before. Maybe because I felt like I knew a couple of people, which can be a positive thing if you like the people that you're connecting with, or really despise them, or both. The only thing that put me off a bit is that a large part of the story towards the end is about Linn himself, and they're really just making sure that you want to read the next novel. I get that, but still it took up too much space. I will continue to read those books because they're very pleasant time fillers. As I talked about in my last wrap-up, and maybe the wrap-up before, I've been really wanting to read more fantasy these days to escape into stories. I've had the project of reading books for the Nordic Prize, and also I've read too much Knausgård, which does something to you. I really just don't what yet. But nevertheless, I want to be reading more things that couldn't have happened. And that's why I read this one, Rivers of London by Ben Arnovich. I picked this one up because it's an urban fantasy and it's supposed to be funny. And I thought it was. Also, there's 9 books in this series, and I always like to find books in series. Then I have more safe bets if I was ever to not have books I want to read. Anyway, this story is about a young policeman that has just come out of police academy and is now a constable in London. One day he is investigating a murder and he suddenly finds himself talking to a ghost. After a while he discovers that there's a special unit in the London police squad that deals with these kinds of things. And so he starts learning magic to help out solving crimes in the underground. And the reason why it's called Rivers of London is maybe because he meets a lot of people that are rivers in London. It gets kinda abstract. I wasn't surprised about how much I enjoyed this novel because I thought this was kind of a safe bet, but I was surprised of how much I enjoyed the plot, even though it's kinda messy. There are a lot of twists and turns, and I actually was a bit confused when I finished this novel and I had to look up Rivers of London ending explained, which I do sometimes, but not at this level. I was very confused at a certain point. It is quite witty, and it's witty all the way through. It's not witty just in the start or in the end. That's something that bothers me sometimes when it's just fun for about 10 minutes and then it's all over, so that was a very positive thing. And the love that Arnovich shows for London in this novel is terrific. I think it helps if you've been to London or know London or the specific places that are mentioned, because he mentions a lot of them. And luckily Norway isn't that far from London or England, so I've been there a couple of times and I felt like that was a part of the mood in this novel at least. There are also some historical facts that makes this more fun and not educational, but it's a bit of a little spice to the story, I would say. I'm definitely going to read book number 2 in this series, and I guess this might be my next go-to fantasy series. Even though Rivers of London was a bit confusing at times, it was indeed an easy read, and I thought, well, this is pleasant. Let's go and find another easy read. And I thought to myself, what was the most easily read book I read last year? And that I found to be Midnight Library by Matt Haig. So I thought, I know I have a couple of other books from him in my shelf, and then I picked the highest rated ones. And that's Reasons to Stay Alive. This is a memoir and a non-fiction about his struggle with depression. This book goes straight to the point, and in the first couple of pages he says that he wants to kill himself. I think this book is meant to help others, and I say think because I found it to be a bit like what is the goal of this novel. I struggle to understand. He talks a lot about his own experiences, what he found to have helped him, what he found not to have helped him, but it doesn't feel aimed at anyone, even though he says in the novel that this is supposed to help others. So that felt a bit strange. It's hard to explain because on one hand it feels like a guidebook or handbook in dealing with depression. He also talks about historical aspects, about the big celebrities or big world leaders dealing with depression, but also it feels like he's trying to self-help himself. I think the problem for me as a reader might be that it felt a little bit too self-helpy at the same time as it was very much cliché-y. It's an important topic, and as it states in the novel, there are way too many suicides and that rate is not going down. So I would believe that having these books around would help someone, and I hope it does. Looking back at it now, I should maybe have picked up Humans by Matt Haig, which is a sci-fi novel, since I'm already in the mood for fantasy. But I have also found that I don't dislike memoir-style books. They can be quite intriguing. I didn't find this one to be very intriguing for me, but as I said, it's important to have these novels. So that completes this wrap-up. In my yearly goal, I'm supposed to read 53 physical books, and I'm lagging behind with one book, and now I've started actually reading the number 2 book in the Mistborn series by Brandon Sanderson. That's a huge book, and I'm afraid that I'm going to read too few books now before the new year. So maybe in the next book haul it would be Mistborn book number 2, and then just a whole bunch of smaller books, since this really hasn't been the month where I've gone through smaller books, to say the least. If you have read any good books that you would like to recommend, please comment below. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you have a great day, and in light of the last book, I hope you take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!